I've carried the XM-18 from Hinderer for another 2 months after the initial impressions video. And one of the things that stood out to me strongest over the past 8 weeks is how well packaged the ergonomics are for a knife of this size. And I want to be very specific that I am talking about some size dependent issues. Because there are issues, as I noticed before, because the knife is so small, it's basically only a 3-finger grip. And as I found lately, as the temperature has dropped down, with heavy gloves on, it's even more problematic. But again, this is the smallest of this series, so keep that in mind. So looking at knives of its size, it doesn't have the common ergonomic issues that a lot of folders have had, and I've been comparing it to. This is a very nice small folder from San Remu. The ergonomics are absolutely horrible in this region because of what looks to be a relatively innovative design, the sort of fold over clip. It does look kind of cool. It's a little cap lift around the end. It's exposed metal. But the problem is when you grip in this area, you grip right around this loop, this turn, and it's just really uncomfortable. If you're just doing light work, no problem. It's a nice light little knife, relatively small. Backlock works very well. But as soon as you try to do any heavy cutting, all of this area right here, and even this little cap lifter thing, bites really strongly in your hand. It's just uncomfortable. Small Sebenza is essentially just a chunk, a rectangular chunk. It's not really comfortable in any way, shape, or form in terms of ergonomics, and the ergonomics are generally that poor that it affects security. Well built, but ergonomically complete failure. Duke Tiki model. Really nice, well rounded over back of the handle, but the inside, of course, is just these very raw slabs. And again, very thin, very nice, very light, very easy to carry. Very high cutting ability. Point comes around, had to put a point on it. But in terms of ergonomics, relatively poor because these are very thin, bites in your hand if you try to do again any cutting with any amount of force. At the opposite end of the spectrum is, of course, something like this. Your Opinel, which has excellent ergonomics. Very thick handle, swelled in both directions. But of course the problem is very difficult to carry this, no clip, and it's very thick for a pocket carry. So more of an outer sort of coat carry. And of course similar with the Twistmaster. Even knives that I generally enjoy and would describe as overall very good knives commonly have ergonomic issues. This is one Paramitary too. Very difficult to get a comfortable grip on this except for very specific locations. So if I try to hold it just in your normal grip, this area right here is too small. Clip very squarish. And your hand is overlapping on parts of this handle that you normally don't want it to. And it's too small right here to just get a rear grip. You're actually up on top of this. So it's only really comfortable in a full grip like that. Way too squarish. Really need to take this clip off and round it all out. But the XM-18 from Hinderer doesn't have a lot of those issues. I talked about a few small ergonomic issues in initial impressions review because, like I said, the G10's not 100% flush. A couple of these little cutouts that he has in the jimping here, relatively sharp and left unfinished. But again, these are relatively minor. And even the edges on the clip are relatively broken. Not fully rounded over and polished, but I mean not as square as on some of the other knives. So ergonomics, this has really stood out over the past 8 weeks as being one of the more comfortable knives of this size. And of ease of carry. Like I said, it can't compete with the ergonomics of something like the Cold Steel Twistmaster series, which is night and day. I mean, if you were doing a scale where sort of 1 to 5, where 5 is excellent, the Cold Steel Twistmaster sits at about a 5, and the Hinderer can't even rate because it can't compare with a handle, which basically ignores ease of carry, has no pocket clip, and it's just all about ergonomics and security. But if you look at folders that do have pocket clips that are meant to be relatively flattish in profile, this is one of the nicer ergonomic patterns that I had seen, again, for a knife of its size. In regards to cutting ability, when I first got the knife, the edge was relatively dull, and of course it didn't cut very well. It generally failed a lot of stuff, couldn't even cut cardboard or even light ropes. After a proper sharpening, all of that went away. And any shallow cutting, the knife did very well. In the kitchen, like peeling potatoes, cutting up a pizza, that type of stuff. Opening up packages, cutting boxes, cutting light rope. And the reason I say shallow cutting is because deeper cuts force the material to bind on the blade. As the material starts binding on the blade, the cross-section of the blade becomes very important, and you see resistance as the blade's moving through it. But on shallow cuts, it's mainly just about sharpness. When it's just about sharpness, you can sharpen this, cut relatively well. On deeper cutting, it's obviously not going to fare very well. And if you compare it to a knife like the Duke or Opinel, which are designed just to cut very well, it falls behind. And it can often be a many to one in terms of performance because the blade stock is much thicker, and the edge is much thicker, and the edge angle is much higher. Now, so what I found was that carrying it alongside some other knives, it's not the knife that I would pick when I was doing deeper cutting. Because, of course, more force means less control, means higher fatigue, means just lower performance. However, it was nice to have for harder work. When you were doing prying work with the tip, when you had to do harder work with the edge, when you were cutting like metals, like wires, like cables, like opening cans, that type of deal. It was nice to have. It was also a nice knife to have compared to, say, the Opinel, which again does well in general for food preparation. But say if you're taking apart a chicken and you're not wanting to be ultra careful about when you're cutting between the leg and the thigh, when you're cutting the wingtips off, when you're cutting the carcass in a couple of pieces. If you are very careful and you cut between the bones and you're only cutting the soft tissue, Opinel does relatively well. Because again, you don't need a lot of durability if you're just cutting through soft tissue. But what about if you're in a bit of a rush or in a bit of a time constraint and you just want to do it relatively fast and get the chicken broken apart? Well, then you want a knife with a bit more durability at the edge, and the XM-18 did that relatively well. Cut apart the chicken, and again, when you're cutting meats and stuff, that's shallow cutting. As long as the edge is sharp, it does that well. So it easily trimmed off the fat, cut up all the meat, no issue. And the relatively high edge angle and edge thickness meant that I wasn't concerned at all about the bone work. Put the knife down wherever it fell, between the leg and the thigh, that's where the cut was made. Just cut the carcass where the carcass wanted to be cut, no issues or concern about bones. So again, nice durability aspect there. However, the problem was, for all that such work, I could do the exact same thing with a Spyderco Delica. This is the Wave model that has the Emerson open around it. And there's many different models of the Delica. The Delica and Hinderer are sort of one of the cornerstone or flagship models from Spyderco. The interesting thing is, in spite of the name Delica, this is one of the more heavier built of the Spyderco knives. It has a relatively low saber flat grind, and for Spyderco, a relatively heavy edge profile. Now again, there's many different models of these. They also come in full flat grind models, which generally have a thinner and more acute edge because they're made to sort of cut very well. This is sort of the utility type pattern. So all the harder work that I was doing with the XM-18, when I was doing things that I wouldn't want to do with an Opinel or Duke, because they just don't have the cross section, and I would say, okay, I'll do it with the XM-18. I could also do it with Spyderco Delica as well, because it has a very similar edge thickness and cross section, and it also doesn't have the abrupt taper that, for example, the Opinel has in the tip. And you can see, because of the distal taper, the Opinel goes to an extremely fine tip, and you don't want to do any prying with that at all. You just snap it off or bend it. So the question I started asking myself after a few weeks was, where's the functional advantage of the XM-18? What kind of work would I be doing that I wouldn't want to do with the Spyderco Delica, because it actually would be at risk of damaging it? Now, if you look at the XM-18, there's two aspects of this which stand out, and one is the pivot, and the other one are the standoffs. Now, the handle itself is also going to be significantly more rigid due to the construction. This is essentially a thermoplastic with liners, and of course you're looking at solid metal construction on this. But basically, the main advantage, in theory anyway, is that this knife can take a lot more lateral or prying forces because the stop-in is much heavier. The body itself has much more metal in it, and the standoffs, of course, are much heavier. The question or concern that I have is, does the level of lateral forces that you would need to damage the Spyderco Delica damage the XM-18 as well? And that's a curious question. And that's the last question I have to sort of be answered in terms of overall functionality of the knife. Now, in terms of edge retention, ease of sharpening, sharpenability, and ultimate sharpness, I've kept it relatively sharp, sharp enough to shave with, facial shaving I mean, relatively easy. And I've just been using a 3,000 and 8,000 grit water stone, which work out perfectly fine. Diamond stones would be more efficient, but I wanted to see if I could do it with water stones and no big issue to it. The only problem is, because I've been using it for rougher soft metal work, that kind of deal, the edge does pick up a few dings and dents and little chips. So you end up with an edge that's nice and super polished, but then has little tiny dings and dents in various spots. But other than that, no real concern. And similar to any of the ultra sort of high carbide steels, like S30V, any of the high vanadium steels, you are going to notice to take a bit more time and finer stones, unless, like I said, you switch to something like diamonds, because diamonds pretty much ignore steel content. It doesn't matter if the knife is made out of S90V or 420V, an extra coarse diamond stone each through it, like it's not even there, because the hardness of diamonds compared to steels or even carbides is extremely large. So diamond abrasives don't see steel hardnesses at all. There's too small of a change. And even carbide content, again, too small of a change. When diamond will hone solid carbide relatively easily. In terms of corrosion resistance, I haven't seen any spotting on this. Haven't used any oil or any lubricant of any kind, but haven't done anything that I would have expected to spot. Essentially, even a moderately corrosion resistant stainless. Don't keep it absolutely clean when I'm working in the kitchen on fruit acids and stuff like that. But again, even something of the corrosion resistance of, say, ATS-34 is easily capable of withstanding that level of corrosion. I haven't actually left it wet or been working in salt water conditions, which is what you would need to get to really put an effort into seeing whether or not it was functionally stainless. Now, the last thing I want to mention is that this is going to be sent out on a pass around to a few of my friends. So this knife, along with Spyderco Delica and a couple of Sanremu clones, which I want to get, more similar to the XM-18. And the reason for the Spyderco Delica and the Sanremu clones is that they will be sort of the sacrificial lambs. In which case, the people doing the pass round will use the XM-18 for the primary work. And then whenever they get to something which they figure, hey, this might be a bit too hard for a small folding knife to handle, they can use a Sanremu clone, they can use a Spyderco Delica, and they can see what happens. And if those knives handle it without, any concern, well, then you'd sort of expect the XM-18 to handle it as well. But the clone and the Spyderco Delica would be expected after the end of the pass round to probably take some damage. And then we can look at the rather interesting question, can the XM-18 handle that work without getting damaged? And if the answer is yes, well, then you've shown a true advantage, functionally, of the XM-18, which is that it has a higher functional level of durability than these other knives. Now, of course, in terms of value or worth or any of that kind of things, there's lots of other things that could be incorporated into a knife. For example, the secondary market resale value of these knives is extremely high. The fit and finish of these knives is extremely high. Collectability and that type of deal. I mean, there's no real demand in the secondary market for this Sanremu knife, or even for this Spyderco Delica with the wave opening. Nowhere near this. I mean, if I put this up for sale, you sell it essentially overnight. You don't sort of on these, and you have to normally take a significant loss, where if anything, the resale value of XM-18s tends to go up over time. So that's sort of my comments after about another 8 weeks of carry. Again, generally relatively positive. Big question is the functional durability actually there compared to a relatively robust sort of utility type model, such as, for example, the Spyderco Delica? And hopefully once the pass round gets going and people start using it and we get more information and more feedback, we'll have a more informative answer to that question. And we can also look at other issues, for example, ease of sharpening and edge retention in different environments, with different stones, with different skill levels, with different amounts of experience and information, and other such commentary.